The wind came first, not as sound but as pressure, a weight against the barn doors that made the old wood groan in a way Adeline Marsh had never heard it groan before, as if the building itself understood what was coming and had decided to say so. She stood with her hand flat against the iron ring in the floor, the lantern swinging from her belt, and beneath the roar she heard it again. Fists, human fists on wood, desperate and irregular, the rhythm of someone who had run out of choices and was down to the last one available. She had one moment to decide what kind of woman she was going to be for the rest of her life. The storm did not offer her a second. Months earlier, the sky over Coldwater Flats had still believed itself ordinary. The summer of 1935 came to the Texas Panhandle, the way bad news comes to a person who already knows it is coming, without surprise, without mercy, settling in with the patient permanence of something that has decided to stay. The land out here had never been soft. It asked everything of the people who worked it and offered nothing in return except the hard education of consequence. But that summer felt different from the ones before it. It felt like even the promise of next year had been quietly canceled, leaving only the heat, the dust, and the particular silence of things that had stopped trying. Adeline Marsh was 18 years old and she had been alone for 2 months. 2 months since the fever took her father, Silas Marsh, in the gray hour before dawn, on a morning in May, the mockingbirds still going outside, as if the world had not noticed that a good man was leaving it. The doctor came from Amarillo too late, arriving in the long afternoon shadows to find Silas already gone, and Adeline at the kitchen table with her hands folded in her lap, very still, in the way of someone who has already moved through the worst of a thing before anyone else arrived to help carry it. The neighbors came for the burial. They brought their black clothes and their casseroles wrapped in dish towels and their careful expressions, and they stayed through the rituals that small towns have always used to mark the passing of one of their own. And then, as was the custom of such places, when the spectacle of grief had run its course, they went home to their own lives and left Adeline to the silence of the homestead. The condolences lasted about a week. The casseroles lasted a few days longer. After that, the quiet moved in the way the dust did without asking permission, finding every room settling into every hour, regardless of what she did to keep it out. Silas Marsh had not been a man who made noise in the world. He farmed the way certain things exist without apology, and without performance, shaped by decades of wind and hard work, until his hands looked less like something grown and more like something made. The knuckles thickened, the palms carrying calluses built from years of the same repeated motions. He spoke rarely. He listened with his whole body, the kind of listening that most people in Coldwater Flats had read as slowness or indifference, neither of which it was. It was vigilance. The patient, deliberate attention of a man who understood that the world communicated most clearly to those who could make themselves quiet enough to receive it. Adeline had inherited his eyes, that pale, watchful gray that registered everything without giving much back, in his capacity for silence, which she now found herself inhabiting in a way that was both comforting and strange, like wearing a coat that had belonged to someone taller. She checked the fences at the hour he had always checked them. She read the evening sky from the same spot near the eastern pasture fence, where she had watched him stand every dusk of her childhood. She made her coffee in his battered tin pot and drank it standing at the kitchen window looking out at the barn, the way he had always looked at it, as though it were a question he had not yet finished answering. The land was hers now, the house, the fields that had produced almost nothing in 3 dry years, and the barn, that great weathered structure at the far edge of the property, its boards silvered by decades of sun and wind, its roof patched in 3 places with tin-gone rust-colored at the edges. It sat the way certain old things sit, with the solid indifference of something that has already outlasted most of what the world has thrown at it and expects to outlast the rest. It was a Saturday morning in late July when Adeline finally walked out to begin the work she had been avoiding for 2 months. She had told herself it was because she was not ready. That was true the way most painful things are true, partially leaving out the part that matters most. The fuller truth was that the barn had belonged to her father in a way the house never quite had. The house was where he slept and ate and occasionally finished a complete sentence. The barn was where he lived, where he moved through his days with a purposefulness the house never seemed to draw out of him. She could feel his presence the moment she pulled the heavy double doors open and stood in the flooding morning light. The smell of him in the wood, in the rope, in the air itself, the arrangement of tools and equipment that was entirely his, the particular weight of the place. Hollis was already there sitting at the threshold as if he had been waiting. He was a big dog, a shepherd mix with a coat the color of charcoal, an old amber, his eyes carrying the kind of attentiveness that made people feel seen rather than merely observed. He had been Silas's dog in the way certain animals choose certain people, not through training or circumstance, but through some alignment of temperament that runs you below the level of decision. Since Silas died, Hollis had taken to sleeping outside the barn rather than in the house, as though the keeping of it had become a responsibility he had assumed without being asked. He looked up at Adeline now, and she had the unsettling feeling that he understood more about this morning than she did. "All right," she said quietly, "let's get it done." She started with the heaviest work first, the way her father had taught her, without ever framing it as a lesson. Visible progress early in the day kept a person honest about the hours ahead. It prevented the particular self-deception of rearranging small things and calling it productivity. The barn was vast and cluttered with decades of accumulated life, coils of old rope on iron hooks, rusted harnesses draped over wooden rails, wooden crates stacked without apparent system, a hand plow that had begun to look like part of the floor. Every item was a decision she was not yet ready to make. Keep it or surrender it, hold it or let it go. She kept moving because moving was the only defense she had against the weight of those decisions. The morning wore on. Hollis dozed near the open doors, one ear always turned toward the interior, tracking her by sound. The light shifted as it climbed, coming down through the gaps in the boards and long, angled columns, full of reddish dust that caught the sunlight and held it. She worked steadily without needing to narrate the effort to herself. She moved things, she assessed things, she made the small, irreversible decisions about what was beyond saving and what still had use left in it. She did not cry, which surprised her a little. She had cried at the burial and twice in the week that followed, but out here doing his work in his space, the grief arranged itself differently. Less like a wound and more like a weight she was learning to carry in a way that did not slow her down. It was around mid-morning that she reached the feed bin. It sat in the far northeast corner of the barn, half hidden behind a collapsed shelf and several broken wooden pallets stacked against the wall as though deposited there and forgotten. The bin itself was a large, iron-strapped construction built from heavy oak planks, dark with age and use. She had seen it 100 times without giving it much thought. It was simply part of the barn's permanent architecture, something that had always been there and would presumably always be there, requiring nothing. It had not been used in years. The grain inside had compressed into a solid mass at the bottom with the texture of old clay. She needed to move it to access the wall behind it, where she could see water damage in the boards that needed assessing. She began to empty it with a flat shovel, working it methodically from one end to the other, breaking up the compressed mass and shoveling it into the wheelbarrow she had positioned alongside. When her blade scraped the last of the grain from the bottom of the bin, it caught on something. Not the grain, not the wood, a gap in the floor. She set the shovel aside, knelt and brushed the remaining grain away with her bare hands, working from the center outward. And then she saw it, set into a slight depression in one of the floor planks, almost invisible against the dark oak grain, a small iron ring, flush-mounted, machined to sit below the surface to become part of the wood. It was set and invisible, unless a person were looking for it with their hands as well as their eyes. This was not the casual ironwork of a barn fitting. This had been built to disappear. Adeline sat back on her heels and looked at it. Hollis appeared at her shoulder without a sound. He stood close beside her, his nose working the air near the floor, a low, concentrated sound moving through his chest, not alarm, something more like recognition. "Easy," she murmured. She hooked 2 fingers through the ring and pulled. The plank lifted with the smooth, deliberate, controlled precision of something engineered. It was hinged. It had always been hinged. The board swung upward on its iron pivot with a movement so controlled it could only have been the result of careful design and regular use. And what rose to meet her was not the packed dirt she had expected beneath a barn floor, but a square of deep-breathing darkness. A trapdoor. The air that came up from it was unlike anything in the hot barn, cool and still, and carrying the mineral scent of deep earth and dry stone, something ancient and undisturbed, something that had been maintained and kept ready. The smell of a place tended in secret for a very long time. Adeline did not move for nearly a full minute. She simply knelt at the edge of that darkness and breathed and felt the coolness move over her face and forearms and tried to understand what she was looking at. Inside the frame, bolted to rough stone at a careful angle, was a ladder. Heavy, solid, built from thick oak rungs set into iron-banded side rails, each rung worn smooth at the center from years of use. Not occasional use, regular habitual use. The use of someone who had been down there often and for a long time. Her father had been down there, many times. He had climbed that ladder in the dark with the ease of long familiarity, and she had never known. The knowledge of that ignorance settled in her chest like a stone she was going to have to learn to carry. She lit a lantern from the hook on the north wall. Her hands were steadier than she expected. She secured Hollis with a flat palm, and the words she had heard her father use, the gesture that meant stay and meant it absolutely. Hollis sat. His ears went straight up. She gripped the top rung and began to descend. The stone was cold against her palms in a way that shocked after the heat of the barn, a cold that came from depth rather than from wind. The darkness closed around her. 10 rungs, 12. The ladder curved left around a stone corner and ended, and her boots found packed earth worn smooth. She lifted the lantern. The light bloomed outward. Adeline Marsh stood in a room, not a cellar, not a crawl space or a simple earthen hollow dug for cold storage. A room large and deliberately rectangular, its proportions too precise to be accidental. The packed earth floor was worn smooth by years of footfall. The walls were thick, expertly laid stone rising 8 feet to a timber ceiling, reinforced with heavy crossbeams, set at regular intervals. This space had been built with extraordinary care over a great deal of time, by someone who had not rushed, had not cut corners, had built each element to last. Along the eastern wall stood rows of sealed wooden barrels, each one stenciled with a single word in her father's careful block lettering. Water. She counted them in the lantern light, 16 in total. Each sealed with fresh beeswax, the wax still faintly pale at the edges where it had not yet darkened with age. Along the opposite wall, shelving ran from floor to ceiling, laden with earthenware crocks, sealed tight with wax, preserved vegetables and oil, dried fruit wrapped in wax cloth, salted meat in brine grain in sealed containers. Behind the shelving, neatly folded wool blankets, stacked with precise care, cedar blocks, tucked between the layers to keep the moths away. Boxes of tallow candles. Spare lanterns with their reservoirs filled. A tin medical kit latched shut with a small red cross painted on the lid. In the center of the room stood a small, efficient iron stove, its chimney pipe disappearing into the stone wall through a concealed flue, routed with such care that it had become functionally invisible. The ventilation system was something else entirely. A series of pipes, no wider than a man's arm, constructed of joined sections of iron, ran through the stone at carefully calculated angles, drawing fresh air from outside through 3 separate paths, so that no single blockage could ever cut off the airflow. The pipes entered the shelter from 3 different directions. The air in this room, 10 feet below the surface of a Texas barn in the middle of a summer drought, was clean and breathable and cool. In the far corner, built directly into the stone, was a small desk and a shelf with a low wooden stool set before it, its legs worn smooth from use. Stacked on the desk in neat order were 5 journals, their covers worn soft from handling their spines cracked from years of being opened and closed. Each one dated on the front cover in her father's hand. The earliest bore the year 1903, the latest 1934. Beside the journal sat a small tin box with a brass hasp and lock. The key, she realized with a start, was the small, plain key she had found on her father's person after his death, on its cord around his neck, which she had placed in the kitchen drawer, without knowing what had opened. She sat down on the stool slowly, the way you sit when the ground has shifted beneath you and you are not yet certain the new surface will hold. She opened the first journal. What she found was not a confession, it was not an explanation. What she found were instructions. Page after page of careful, practical, methodical instruction written in her father's precise hand. How to rotate the water barrels on a 6-week cycle to maintain freshness, always working east to west, so the rotation could be tracked without marking. How to inspect the beeswax seals on the crocks, pressing the thumb at the junction of wax and earthenware, and feeling for any micro-separation that indicated the seal had begun to fail. The precise schedule for cleaning the stove and checking the chimney flue for obstruction, spring and fall. How to calculate caloric needs per person across 30, 60, and 90 days based on the current inventory. A detailed map of the room's contents with a restocking priority list in order of perishability. It was the record of a man who had been maintaining this place for decades with the same rigor and consistency he brought to the fields and fences above ground. The record of someone for whom this room was not a project or an experiment, but a permanent commitment, an ongoing responsibility taken as seriously as any other element of the farm. She read for a long time. The lantern burned steadily. Above her faintly she could hear Hollis pacing on the barn floor. She moved through 3 of the 5 journals before she arrived at what she was looking for. Or rather, at the place where it should have been and was not. Because the journals were thorough in every practical detail and entirely completely silent on the one question that mattered above all others. Why? There was no entry that said, "I am building this because of what happened." No sentence that began with "when I was young." No paragraph that explained a fear, or described a memory, or named the wound that had driven a man to spend 30 years building a survival room beneath his barn in secret. He had written everything down except the thing that would have made sense of everything else. She turned to the final journal. The last entry was dated April 3rd, 1935, 6 weeks before he died. The handwriting was shakier than the earlier entries, the pen pressing harder into the paper in places, as though he had needed the resistance to maintain his grip. He had been sick by then, though neither of them had known how sick. She had attributed his slowness to the heat. He had not corrected her. The entry read in his practical way through the usual inventory and maintenance notes. Refilled the northeast corner barrels. Seals on crocks 7 through 12 still holding. Flue is clear. Inventory at full capacity. Everything is ready. And then below that, separated from the practical record by a deliberate space, a single line. When the sky turns black, you will know. Adeline read the line 3 times. She sat with it in the quiet of the underground room and felt it move through her. She did not know what the sky turning black meant. She did not know what she was supposed to know when it happened. But she understood, in the way you understand things that live below the level of rational thought, that her father had not been leaving her a riddle. He had been leaving her a warning in the only language available to someone who had never found adequate words for the thing that had shaped him. She closed the journal carefully and set it back in its place. Hollis's bark, one sharp sound from above, finally brought her back. She climbed the ladder into the heat of the barn and stood blinking in the summer light, and she did not open the locked tin box that day. The key was in the kitchen drawer. It would still be there tomorrow. She closed the trap door, moved the feed bin back over it with considerable effort, and went inside to make her lunch. In the weeks that followed, Adeline's standing in Coldwater Flats underwent a quiet but significant deterioration. Though deterioration was perhaps not the right word, since the relationship had never been particularly warm to begin with. Silas Marsh had not been a social man. He had attended church in the dutiful way of a man who understands that certain forms of community participation are required rather than chosen. And he had done his business at Hiram Goss's general store, and he had gone back to his land. Adeline had grown up in the particular solitude of a child raised by someone who preferred the company of open sky to the company of rooms full of people who had given her books and taught her to read weather, and shown her by example that a person's worth had nothing to do with how comfortable they made others feel in their presence. She had known the townspeople of Coldwater Flats by name and by face. She had attended school and church in the ordinary way of a young person growing up in a small place. But she had never been woven into the town's fabric in any way that went deeper than proximity. Now, without her father as even the thinnest buffer between her and the town's attention, she found herself exposed in a way she had not anticipated. The pattern of her days had changed visibly. Mornings underground, learning the ventilation system by touch and by feel, following the journals with the focused attention of someone working from a text she is determined to master. Afternoons hauling water between the well and the barn, noting what needed replenishing, making entries in the plain-covered notebook she had bought at Goss's store for 50 cents. She emerged from the barn at odd hours, covered in reddish-gray dust, her expression set and inward, her pace carrying the unmistakable quality of someone engaged in serious work. In Coldwater Flats in the summer of 1935, that quality apparently required explanation. Vesta Kroom provided the explanation that stuck. She was a tall, angular woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair kept in a severe arrangement. And a moral authority she wore as naturally as her Sunday dress, as if it were simply woven into her structure and required no particular effort to maintain. She sat on the ladies' auxiliary board and organized the church socials and possessed the gift common in small towns of being able to say things that should not be said while making them sound like charitable concern. It was a Tuesday afternoon at Hiram Goss's general store. Adeline had come in for lamp oil. She was making her way down the main aisle when Vesta's voice rose above the general quiet of the afternoon with the easy confidence of a woman who has never had reason to lower it. It's the grief, Vesta said, addressing no one in particular, which was how she always addressed everyone. I've seen it before. When you're young and you lose the only parent you have left, loss like that does something to the mind. Something that looks from the outside very much like purpose. She shook her head slowly. She's out there at all hours, in and out of that barn covered in dirt. A girl alone like that with no clear direction, no plan that anyone can make sense of. The pause she left was perfectly timed. Her father's gone and she's taken to living like a prairie dog. The name required no additional construction. It attached itself immediately without malice, without ceremony, with the casual efficiency of a community assigning meaning to something it finds uncomfortable and wants to make manageable. Dusty Adeline, the prairie dog girl. She heard it first from Boyd Lassiter on the main street the following Thursday. He was a lean young man of about 22, with the kind of physical confidence that comes from never having been made to doubt himself in any serious way. He tipped his hat as she passed with an elaborate theatrical gesture and called out, "Keeping the dust company." "Today, Adeline?" The men with him laughed. He grinned with the satisfaction of someone who has landed a joke exactly where he aimed it. She said nothing. She had learned from her father that the best answer to this kind of thing was continued existence, the quiet and relentless fact of her own persistence. You kept working. You kept showing up. She kept working. It was in the alley behind Goss's store, loading her wagon one afternoon, that she first noticed Ambrose Tully watching her without the smirk the others wore. He was 16. Garrett Tully's younger brother, lean and uncertain in his own skin, in the way boys of that age often are caught, somewhere between Boyd Lassiter's crowd and something he had not yet named for himself. He did not say anything that day. He just looked and looked away when she caught him, and she registered the moment without attaching much weight to it. Not yet. It was Dalton Reeve who came to the homestead itself. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon when the heat sat heaviest on the land, stepping out of a good automobile in a suit that was too clean for the country he was standing in. He was a banker out of Amarillo, a man who held the notes on half the failing farms in 3 counties, and who had the particular gentleness of someone who has learned that cruelty delivered kindly does more work than cruelty delivered plain. "Miss Marsh," he said, removing his hat, "I was sorry to hear about your father. A good man." He let his gaze move briefly past her to the barn, the fields gone thin and brown at the edges, taking in the whole property in a single practiced assessment. "I'll be direct with you, because I respect you too much for anything else. A young woman alone out here with 160 acres in a drought that shows no signs of breaking, that's a great deal for anyone to carry." He produced a small card from his coat pocket and held it toward her. "I'd like to make you an offer, a fair one, more than fair given how things stand." "I'm not selling," Adeline said. He smiled unhurried, the smile of a man who considers no to be the beginning of a negotiation rather than the conclusion of one. "Of course. Take your time with it." He settled his hat back on his head and looked at her for a moment with something that occupied the careful middle ground between concern and calculation. "I'll come back when the land matters less to you than what the land costs you. People always come to that place eventually." He drove away, and Adeline stood watching the dust settle behind his automobile, and something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the shelter below the barn floor. That evening, she descended again into the underground room, and for the first time took the key from the kitchen drawer and opened the locked tin box on the desk. Beneath her father's spare spectacles, folded in soft cloth beneath the whetstone worn concave from years of the same practiced motion, at the bottom of the box, face down, was a photograph. Its edges worn soft from handling, its surface protected by a square of thin cloth laid carefully over it. She turned it over. A woman young, perhaps 20 years old, with dark hair pinned loosely and eyes that held something Adeline recognized immediately because she had seen it in the mirror every morning of her life. That same watchful stillness, that same quality of a person who observes carefully and speaks only when it matters. The woman's mouth held the suggestion of a smile that had not quite arrived, or perhaps of a word she was deciding whether to say. Adeline had no memory of her mother. The fever had taken her before Adeline was old enough to form memories that would hold. She had only her father's occasional fragmentary offerings across the years. She had your eyes. She liked early mornings. She could name every grass on the panhandle by its seed head. And now, for the first time, a face. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting older and rawer than the careful block lettering of the journals. Not the writing of the man who had maintained 5 decades of careful records, but of a much younger man writing something he was only just finding words for 2 lines. She pushed me into the cellar and covered the door with her own body. I will not forget. I will not fail. Adeline read the lines and held them and read them again and felt them settle against everything she had seen in this room, against all the sealed crocks and water barrels and the iron stove and the 3-path ventilation system, until something that had been incomplete in her began slowly to become whole. There had been a cellar before this one, before the stone walls and the beeswax seals and the 30 years of careful maintenance. Before all of it, there had been a simpler cellar somewhere on some property that no longer existed, and someone had pushed a boy down a ladder and then covered the door with her own body. The woman in the photograph was not her mother. She was her grandmother. The woman who had run across some yard she could not now imagine with a child's hand in hers, while a sky she could not now imagine went black above them. She pushed me into the cellar and covered the door with her own body. Adeline set the photograph carefully in her lap and looked around at the room her father had built. At the water barrels and the sealed crocks, in the wool blankets, in the iron stove, in the ventilation pipes pulling clean air from outside. At the evidence of 30 years of solitary, uncelebrated labor in the dark. Labor that no one had seen, that no one had praised, that the town of Coldwater Flats had not known to be grateful for, and would not know until it needed it. He had turned the worst thing that had ever happened to him into this, into stone and clean air, and enough food and water to keep a dozen people alive through whatever the sky decided to do. He had turned a boy's survival, a survival purchased at a cost he could never stop paying, into a room that could purchase it again for people he would never meet. And no one had known. He had never asked anyone to know. She closed the tin box and left the key in the lock. She climbed the ladder back into the barn as the afternoon light was going gold and long across the panhandle, and Hollis arose from where he had been lying and pressed his solid, warm weight against her legs. She stood for a moment with her hand on his head, breathing the heat and the dust and the smell of old wood. Outside, Coldwater Flats was going about its evening. She could hear the sound of someone's supper dishes through the still air. The ordinary sounds of a town that believed, as towns do, that the world it could see was the whole of the world. 3 weeks into her work on the shelter, Adeline finally allowed herself to sit still. She walked to the far edge of the property where the land flattened toward the horizon and sat directly on the hard, cracked earth and let herself think about Silas Marsh in a way she had not permitted herself since the burial. Not the practical Silas of the journals, the other one, the father she had known and not known for 18 years. She admitted to herself in the flat light of that afternoon that she had sometimes been ashamed of him. Not deeply, not in any way she would have named at the time or ever admitted aloud. But there had been moments at school, at church, in the company of other girls whose fathers could talk about horses or the news without going silent mid-sentence, as though listening for something only they could hear, when she had wished he were more ordinary, more comfortable in the social world, more willing to perform the rituals that other men performed without apparent cost. She sat with that admission in the heat and felt the particular weight of guilt that comes from understanding someone after the moment when understanding could have changed anything. It was Ambrose Tully who found her there walking the fence line on some errand of his own and stopped a respectful distance off. He did not say much, which she was coming to understand was a quality he had inherited from his older brother rather than from Boyd Lassiter's crowd. He picked up a water bucket she had left near the well without being asked and carried it the rest of the way to the barn, set it down, looked at her for a moment as if deciding whether to say something, and then did not, and left. Boyd caught him on his way back toward town. She heard it from the barn door, Boyd's voice carrying in the still air. Helping the prairie dog dig her hole now, Ambrose. The men with him laughed. Ambrose did not. He kept walking, and something in his shoulders had gone tight, in a way she recognized the particular tightness of a person discovering they no longer fit easily inside a joke they used to find simple. That night, she descended into the shelter and sat at the desk with her father's journals and her own plain notebook, and she began for the first time to write things down in her own hand. Not instructions yet, just the date and what she had checked and what needed checking next. The old and the new sitting together in the lantern light. She thought about Dalton Reeves' voice, patient and certain, promising to return. She thought about her father climbing this ladder alone for 30 years, while the town decided what to make of his silences. She looked west through the open barn doors above, at the flat blue evening sky, unchanged and indifferent, and giving nothing away about what it was already somewhere beyond the horizon beginning to gather. She had work to do in the morning. The birds stopped singing on a Monday morning in the second week of August, and the silence they left behind was not like any silence Adeline Marsh had encountered before. She had heard birds go quiet when a hawk crossed low over the pasture, that quick communal hush with a direction to it, a cause you could locate and name. This was nothing like that. This arrived all at once, as though every living creature on the Texas Panhandle had received the same instruction at the same moment and simply obeyed it. The meadowlarks that had been filling the fence posts since April were gone, not quieted, gone. She checked the posts where they reliably perched and found nothing but empty wood and the hard white sky pressing down on everything below it. Hollis felt it before she could name it. He had been sleeping in the barn doorway the way he always did, but that Monday morning he was already sitting upright. When she arrived, his muzzle lifted into the still air, his amber eyes carrying a quality of attention she had not seen from him before. Not alertness exactly, something more considered than that. The focus of an animal processing information that had no easy interpretation. She said nothing about any of it in town because there was no one left in Coldwater Flats who would receive it as anything other than further confirmation of the strangeness they had already decided was hers. The cattle in the distant field stood motionless through the worst heat of the afternoon, distributed across the dry grass in the suspended stillness of animals that have sensed something approaching from a direction they cannot name. Not grazing, not moving toward water, just standing heads low, waiting for whatever it was they were waiting for. The second week brought a yellowing at the western edge of the sky, subtle enough that a person inclined to dismiss things could blame it on dust from a distant cattle drive and feel satisfied with that explanation. It deepened anyway. By midweek, the sun itself had changed, becoming a pale disk that gave heat without presence, hanging in brass-colored air, every shadow on the ground falling at an angle that felt persistently, quietly wrong. Then working outside one afternoon, Adeline noticed the taste. Metal on the back of her tongue, faint but unmistakable, like old coins held in the mouth. She had no prior reference for it, and no name for it, and no use pretending it was something ordinary. She doubled her pace. Mornings became a strict, sequenced routine of inspection. She worked through the shelter inventory crock by crock, pressing her thumb against each seal feeling. She refilled 2 barrels that had been partially drawn down over the preceding weeks. She tested the airflow at each ventilation opening with a damp strip of cloth, watching the fabric move, confirming without needing to think about it what she had spent the summer learning. She began staging extra supplies at the base of the ladder, additional lamp oil, matches wrapped against moisture. She moved her bedroll down into the corner near the stove, not permanently, but arranged and ready alongside Hollis's water bowl and 2 folded blankets. She was on her knees, smoothing the second blanket into place, when she heard boots on the hard ground outside, steady and deliberate, and her hands went still before her mind caught up to why. She rose and crossed to the barn entrance, and Garrett Tully was crossing the open ground toward her. He was a compact man of about 34, with a square jaw and forearms that spoke plainly of years of sustained physical work. He stopped 10 feet from the barn doors, carrying nothing, his eyes moving once past her into the barn's interior before settling back on her face. "Your father's barn," he said. "Is it ready?" It was not what she had braced for. She had built a complete set of responses for Boyd Lassiter's practiced grin and Vestacroom's careful civic cruelty, but she had nothing prepared for a direct question asked without performance, without any suggestion. that the asking of it was itself a kind of joke. Yes, she said. Garrett looked west once at the bruised amber sitting heavy at the horizon, and something moved behind his eyes that was not surprise. It was the expression of a man whose suspicion had just been confirmed. He nodded once, the kind of nod that closes a matter rather than opening one, and turned and walked back the way he had come. He had not asked to see anything. He had not explained what he knew or how he knew it or why he had come. From another man it might have felt dismissive. From Garrett Tully it felt like the most complete form of respect he had available, the respect of treating her as someone who knew exactly what she was doing and had no need to prove it. It was the first time since her father died that anyone had offered her that. She went back to work. The following morning, she walked to Hiram Goss's store for lamp oil, and what she found there told her clearly how far Garrett Tully's respect did not extend to the rest of Coldwater Flats. Boyd Lassiter was holding court near the counter with the relaxed authority of a young man who has never once felt unwelcome in a room. He was talking about the yellow haze with the dismissive certainty of someone explaining something simple to people who are making it unnecessarily complicated. "Dust off the trail," Boyd said, sweeping some hand. "We get a dry spell, the cattle work the plains. Dust sits in the air a week or two. Nothing a good rain won't clear." He grinned at the men around him. Half the county acting like the Book of Revelation because the sky's a funny color. Like nobody here's seen a dry August before. Vesta Kroom, examining bolts of cloth at the far counter, added without lifting her eyes, "When a person has been through a difficult season, ordinary things can start to seem threatening. The mind reaches for patterns." She let the pause settle exactly where she intended it. It's understandable given the circumstances. No one in the store looked at Adeline. She paid for her lamp oil and left, and outside the heat pressed down with the particular weight of something that has stopped pretending to be temporary. That same week, the letter arrived from Dalton Reeves' bank in Amarillo, and it was not the letter she had expected. It was not another offer to purchase the land. It was a tax notice, official and dry, informing Miss Marsh that the county assessment on the Whitfield property had been moved forward, payment now due within 3 weeks, rather than the customary autumn deadline. The notice attributed the change to a clerical scheduling adjustment. Adeline read it twice. Then she read it a third time and understood that the clerical scheduling adjustment was Dalton Reeve, and that he had not come back to ask her again as he had promised. He had simply arranged for circumstances to make the asking unnecessary. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter flat under both hands and felt something she had not felt since the week after the burial. A cold, focused anger with nowhere yet to go. She walked into town the next morning and found Hiram Goss behind his counter and asked him as evenly as she could manage whether the store might extend a small short-term loan against the following season's accounts, enough to cover the tax difference until she could sell what livestock remained. Goss's face did something complicated. He had known her father for 20 years and had never been among those who laughed at him. She could see that he genuinely wished he could help. But his eyes moved sideways toward the street, toward the direction of Reeves' bank, which held the note on his own store, the same as it held notes on half the properties in the county. "I wish I could," he said. "I do wish I could. But Mr. Reeve and I have a fair amount of business between us, and I can't afford to be the one who puts myself crosswise with him over somebody else's tax bill." She stood there and understood clearly for the first time that Dalton Reeves' power in Coldwater Flats did not need to announce itself. It only needed to be present in every ledger and every favor owed quietly everywhere at once. She walked home with nothing and went straight to the barn. It was 3 days later, going through the earlier journals in search of any note regarding selling off stored grain, that she found the margin entry. It was tucked alongside a routine maintenance record from 1929, written in handwriting smaller and more private than her father's usual hand, as though he had added it quickly and did not intend it to be the first thing a person saw. A short list of names, 8 of them: the Straight family, Vesta Kroom, Hiram Goss, Lon Pruitt, 4 others she recognized from town. Beside each name, a single word written in her father's careful block letters: room. Adeline sat with the list in the lantern light for a long time, Hollis breathing steadily beside her on the packed earth floor, and understood something that came close to breaking her open. Her father had not built this place only for the 2 of them. He had been quietly determining for years who else would need a door to come through. Not the people who liked him, not the people who respected him, the people who needed it. including the woman who had given his daughter a name designed to wound, including the man who had watched his daughter be humiliated and said nothing because he could not afford to. He had been saving people who did not yet know they needed saving, and he had asked nothing from them in return, not their understanding, not their good opinion, nothing at all. That night alone in the underground room with the list still open on the desk and Dalton Reeves' tax notice still folded in her coat pocket, something in Adeline finally gave way. She had not wept since the week after the burial. She had told herself there was no time, that the work was the priority, that grief had to wait for a moment when it would not slow her down. But sitting there with her father's impossible, uncelebrated generosity laid bare in front of her, she put her face in her hands and let it come, the kind of weeping she had been keeping at a careful distance for 2 months, the kind that does not ask permission. Was she doing this because it was right, or because grief had simply found a shape to pour itself into exactly the way Vesta Kroom had said it had? She did not know. She knelt on the packed earth floor with her father's last words open on the desk above her, and for the first time allowed herself to wonder whether she would know anything at all when the moment came, whether she was simply a girl alone in a room underground performing her father's strangeness because she had nothing else left of him to hold. Hollis came and pressed his full weight against her side and did not move, did not whine, simply stayed his breathing slow and even against her ribs until her own breathing had slowed to match it. She did not have an answer by the time she climbed the ladder into the night air, but she got up the next morning and went back to work, and that she was beginning to understand had always been the only answer that counted for anything. It was 4 nights later, well past midnight, when she found the damage. She had come down to rotate the east side crocks, as the schedule required moving through the routine by feel as much as by lantern light. She worked her way along the shelving from north to south, pressing her thumb against each wax seal in turn, the motion automatic, now her attention only half engaged. When she reached crock number 11, her thumb sank. The seal had not failed gradually. Something had gotten to it from below, working at the junction between wax and earthenware from the inside edge in a way that a surface inspection would not have caught. She lifted the lantern close. Along the lower seam of the lid, she could see the evidence clearly: fine tooth marks in the wax, the systematic work of something small that had found a way into the shelving cavity from beneath the packed earth floor. A rat, or a family of them, moving through some crack in the stone foundation she had not found. Crock 11 was compromised. When she checked crocks 9 and 12 by feel rather than by eye, she found the beginning of the same damage on both. 3 crocks. Late August, less than 3 weeks of preserved food gone by her estimate if she acted immediately. 3 weeks of everything gone if she did not. She did not allow herself to stop and feel the particular dread of it. She took the compromised crocks down from the shelf one at a time and carried them to the desk. She opened the maintenance record and found the reseal procedure her father had written out, in the same methodical way he had written everything else, not because he expected disaster, but because he expected everything and prepared for all of it. New wax. There was a full block of beeswax in the supply chest, along with the small iron pot her father used to mellow it, the wooden paddle, the cloth for wiping the seal's surface clean before reapplying. She set the pot on the stove and fed the flame carefully, keeping it low, watching the wax begin to soften at the edges. Her hands were shaking slightly, which she noticed and then set aside as information without significance. The process took the better part of 2 hours. She cleaned each seal surface of the damaged wax, removing every trace of the old material, before applying the new working around the full circumference of each crock lid, with the wooden paddle building up the seal in 2 careful layers, and then pressing the surface smooth with her thumb while the wax was still workable. She found the rat entry point on her second pass through the shelving cavity, a gap where 2 stones had shifted slightly in the north corner of the foundation wall. She packed it with a mixture of wet clay and small stones from the floor, or tamping it solid, then piled heavy supply boxes against it as additional measure. It was past 3 in the morning when she set the last resealed crock back in its place on the shelf. She sat on the stool at her father's desk and looked at her hands, which were covered in wax and clay, and were now at rest, steadier than they had been at the start. The lantern burned on the desk beside the open maintenance journal. On the page in front of her, her father's handwriting described exactly what she had just done, step by step, in the calm voice of a man who had considered this possibility and prepared for it the same way he had prepared for everything else. He had known something like this would happen eventually. He had written it down so that whoever came after him would know what to do. She closed the journal and added a note in her own plain notebook below the evening's date, brief and factual. Found damage in Crocs 9/11/12. Source located and sealed. Resealed all three. Inventory intact. Then she climbed the ladder and went to bed and slept without dreaming. Ambrose Tully heard about the tax notice from someone at Goss's store and came to the homestead the following afternoon without announcing himself, carrying a length of fence wire he claimed to have found surplus to his needs. He left it by the barn door and began walking back without making much of it, which was Adeline was coming to understand the Tully family's primary mode of expressing things they did not have words for. She called after him. He stopped. "Tell your brother thank you," she said. He looked back at her with the careful expression of a 16-year-old who is not certain whether he has been caught at something. Garrett heard about the tax notice, Ambrose said. He went to talk to Mr. Reeve. She had not known this. Garrett Tully had walked into Amarillo and stood in Dalton Reeve's office without telling her, without being asked, without making anything of it afterward. What did Reeve say, she asked? Ambrose thought about it. He said Garrett should mind his own business. He also extended the deadline to end of month. She absorbed this. What did Garrett say back? Ambrose almost smiled. Nothing, he said. He just stood there until Mr. Reeve stopped talking. Then he said good afternoon and left. He walked on and she stood watching him go and thought about a man who spoke rarely and listened carefully and understood that sometimes presence alone was sufficient. Boyd Lassiter appeared at the barn the following Saturday with 2 ranch hands behind him, the grin already in place before he had said a word. He stood at the entrance looking in with the deliberate assessment of a man performing an inspection. Still at it, he said. Adeline was checking the main door rope for fraying her hands moving along its length with the focused attention of someone who has done this enough times to know exactly what she is feeling for. I've been trying to work out what exactly it is you think you're doing out here. Boyd went on in the tone of a man asking a genuine question while making clear he has already decided the answer is unflattering. Because from where most people stand, it looks like a girl who's taken her daddy's passing harder than the situation calls for and decided to spend her summer in a barn. He paused. Whatever your father had going out here, it doesn't read like farming to me. And it doesn't look like something a girl your age ought to be spending the summer of her life on. Adeline finished checking the rope and set it down. She turned and looked at Boyd Lassiter with the full unhurried attention she had been learning from a man who was no longer alive to teach it. Go home, Boyd, she said. Close your shutters. The grin wavered. Just for a fraction of a second, the expression of a man encountering a tone he had not prepared for, and then it came back at nearly full strength. Is that right, he said. Yes. He laughed it off, for the men behind him turned and walked back down the road, and she watched him until he cleared the property line. Ambrose had been standing at the fence close enough to hear all of it. When Boyd glanced back to see if he was following, Ambrose had not moved. You coming or not? Boyd called. I think I'll stay a while, Ambrose said. Something crossed Boyd's face, quick and unflattering. Suit yourself, he said and walked on. Ambrose crossed the yard without hurrying and picked up the second coil of rope Adeline had set aside and began checking it the way he had seen her do, working along its length without comment. She did not thank him. Some things asked to be received quietly without ceremony. The bruised purple at the western horizon deepened through that week and into the next, and Adeline measured its progress now the way she would measure a temperature rising toward a threshold a little further each evening than the evening before. The grasshoppers vanished entirely over 3 days in a stretch of grass that in any normal August would have been thick with them. Near the south fence, the prairie dog colony that had been active all summer sealed every mound overnight, every entrance closed, as if a collective decision had been made and executed without debate. She stood at the western fence in the long gold light of early evening and watched the horizon and felt for the first time since finding the journals something she could only describe as certainty. Not loud, not dramatic, a quiet conviction settling into the place where doubt had been living. She was still there when Dalton Reeve's automobile came slowly up the road, parking at the careful distance of a man who has decided that approaching on foot conveys a meaning that arriving by car does not. He walked the rest of the way with his hat in his hand, stopping a few yards off his eyes, moving briefly to the sky behind her before returning to her face. Miss Marsh, he said, I understand my office extended your deadline. I understand you arranged for there to be a deadline in the first place, she said. Something moved across his face, quickly gone, the closest she had seen him come to discomfort. Business is business, he said. I'd hate to see sentiment cost you something you can't recover. The offer still stands. He glanced west again, just briefly, and something in that glance made her wonder whether he saw what she saw at the horizon, and simply chose not to believe it. I won't make this offer again after this season, he said. After that, what comes will come on different terms. He put his hat back on and walked to his automobile and drove away, and she turned back to the horizon where the purple had darkened another shade since that morning, moving with the patience of something that had all the time it needed. She went inside and wrote the date in her notebook, and below it, in the flat, practical hand that had become, without her fully meaning it, to a close imitation of her father's 3 words. Color deeper still. She had work to do before morning, and she did not yet know how little morning was left. The sky broke on a Tuesday, and it did not come the way trouble usually comes to a place that has had time to prepare itself. There was no extended warning, no final opportunity to reconsider. One moment the western horizon held the deep bruised purple Adeline had been measuring for 2 weeks. The next moment, that purple was no longer a horizon at all, because the thing that had been gathering beyond it had stopped gathering and started moving, and the difference between those two states was the difference between a threat and a fact. She saw it from the high ground near the barn at 2 in the afternoon. What came toward Coldwater Flats was not cloud. The word implied something atmospheric, something belonging to the sky rather than the earth, something that would pass and leave the sky behind it largely as it had found it. What came was a wall. Black earth lifted thousands of feet, the full vertical depth of the sky, packed with stripped topsoil and the debris of a decade of drought, moving across the flat country at a speed that made her understand in a way she had not quite understood before what her father's journals had meant when they used the phrase without elaboration. The black blizzard, some things did not require adjectives, some things arrived and spoke entirely for themselves. The temperature dropped in the time it took her to run from the high ground to the barn. She felt it on her forearms first, that sudden total exchange of air, as though the atmosphere itself had been swapped for something else, something that had come from further away and cared nothing about what it found when it arrived. The light died from brass to bruise, to a darkness that had weight and mass, and a sound she felt in her chest cavity before her ears resolved it into anything recognizable. A low, grinding roar that was not thunder, not wind. In any sense, she had a prior word for not anything that the ordinary language of weather had been designed to describe. She was inside the barn and hauling the heavy doors shut before the first gust hit. When it came, the impact was collision, not weather, the whole structure absorbing the blow through the sheer mass of decades of accumulated timber and stone crossbeams, flexing the ridge, groaning dust, filling the interior air so fast and so dense that her lantern cast light only a few feet in any direction before the darkness swallowed it. Hollis pressed against her leg, trembling through his whole body. She put her hand flat on his head and kept it there. "It's all right," she said, though she could barely hear her own voice over the roar. "It's all right." She moved to the trap door and found the iron ring by feel her hands knowing the location without needing to see it. The cool air rose around her face as the board lifted and something in her chest steadied. She was setting her boot on the first rung when Hollis's head came up sharply, and he gave one bark, clean and precise, cutting through the roar with a clarity that should not have been possible given the noise surrounding them. She stopped with her hands on the top rungs and listened. Beneath the grinding wall of sound, beneath the scream of wind, through every seam and joint in the barn's old board, something else, irregular and desperate. The rhythm of someone who had run out of time and was using what was left of it to make noise against wood. Fists, someone at the barn doors. She stood at the top of the ladder with the cool dark open below her, and the storm at its full voice above, and she was still for a long moment. She thought about her father's last entry. She thought about Vesta Kroom's practiced civic cruelty and Boyd Lassiter's easy grin, and 2 months of being Coldwater Flats' most convenient explanation for something no one had bothered to look at directly. All of it present in that moment, all of it pressing against the single decision the moment required. She thought about a photograph at the bottom of a locked box, 2 lines on the back of it in a young man's hand. She pushed me into the cellar and covered the doorway with her own body. Adeline climbed back up. She crossed the barn floor through the roaring dark with her arm over her mouth and her eyes nearly shut, found the door mechanism by feel the thick rope, the iron latch, the handle worn smooth by her father's hand and hers across the summer. She hauled the nearest door inward, just far enough, bracing her full weight against the storm, pushing from the other side. They fell inside in a cluster, not one at a time, but all at once, stumbling and grasping at each other, and at the door frame their faces masked in black dust, their eyes streaming. First through was a man she placed after a moment as Clem straight from the north end of the main street, a young father she knew by sight more than by name. One child pressed against his chest and his wife Opal right behind him, gripping a second child by the wrist. Behind them came Hiram Goss with his store apron still tied at his waist, blinking in the inadequate lantern light. Old Lon Pruitt, moving with a speed his usual deliberate stillness had given no indication he still possessed. Then Vesta Kroom, her silver hair loose and blackened with dust, her good dress shredded at the hem, her eyes when they finally found Adeline's face stripped of everything except something raw and unguarded. Something she had not brought with her on purpose, but that the storm had apparently seen fit to unpack for her. Last through holding the door against the full pressure of the storm until every other person had cleared it was Garrett Tully. He put his shoulder against the door and shoved it shut and held it while the wind pressed back from the other side. Then he turned and found Adeline in the dark, and the understanding that moved between them required no words. He had come to this barn once and asked one question and received one answer, and he had held on to that answer when the wall came down and had led them here. Adeline counted in the swinging lantern light 11 people, 3 of them children. She crossed to the trap door without a word and lifted it, and the warm amber glow rising up from the space below looked in that moment like light arriving from somewhere that operated by entirely different rules than the darkness above it. Opal Straight reached the edge of the opening first among the adults and stopped dead, her younger child still gripped against her side, staring down into the illuminated space below. "What did you dig down here?" she said, her voice high and fraying at the edges. "What is this?" "Somewhere safe," Adeline said. "My father built it to hold." Opal's eyes were wide and her breathing was coming too fast. The particular rapid, shallow breathing of a person whose body has made a decision that her mind has not yet ratified. "You want us to go underground in the middle of this," she said. "You want to put my children in a hole while that thing is out there." "It will hold," Adeline said in the same even tone she had used for everything that summer. The tone she had not inherited but learned through practice from someone who no longer had the opportunity to use it. "I need you to trust me for 1 hour." Opal's older boy, perhaps 7 years old, tugged at her sleeve. His small face was streaked black with dust, and his eyes were asking a question he did not have words for yet. Whatever was holding Opal in place shifted when she looked down at him. Adeline did not wait for the full decision. She reached down and took the younger child from Opal's arms with steady hands and started down the ladder herself, and after a long second, Opal followed because there was nothing else left to do. One by one they went down. Garrett descended first among the men and positioned himself at the base to reach up for each child as they were passed down. Hiram Goss went next, then Lon Pruitt, moving with the careful deliberateness of a very old man who has decided that dignity is still available to him regardless of the circumstances. Vesta Kroom stopped at the edge of the opening and looked down into the warm light for a long moment, and whatever she had assembled to say dissolved before it reached her mouth. She said nothing. She descended. Boyd Lassiter came last among the adults, and Adeline had not known until that moment that he was among them. He had said nothing since coming through the barn doors. His face in the lantern light held nothing she recognized from their previous encounters, none of the practiced ease, none of the ready performance. What remained without those things was something younger and considerably less defended. Adeline brought Hollis down last, guiding his paws on the rungs, and pulled the trapdoor shut above them. The roar of the storm became a low, sustained rumble, contained and present, but at a distance the stone could manage. Something the body could process without the specific animal terror of being exposed. 11 people stood in the lantern light of the underground room and looked at what Silas Marsh had built across 3 decades of solitary labor, and the silence that followed had no precedent in any of their lives. A room that had no right to exist in the terms of the world they thought they understood, prepared by a man they had never tried to understand present, at precisely the moment when it was the only thing standing between them, and what was happening above. Opal Strait had sunk onto a wooden crate near the wall with both children pulled close, her breathing still rapid. Her eyes moved over the shelving, the sealed barrels, the iron stove, the neatly stacked blankets, and her expression passed through disbelief and came out somewhere more complicated on the other side. Adeline worked. She moved through the space the way she had moved through every task that summer, without hurry, without waste, the quiet economy of someone who has internalized a system so completely that execution no longer requires deliberate thought. Blankets first carried to the children into Lon Pruitt, who had lowered himself onto a crate near the stove and was shaking in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. She lit the iron stove and nursed the flame from small kindling to a steady burn before adjusting the damper. She opened a crock of preserved peaches and brought portions to the children in the small tin cups from the lower shelf. She filled the ladle from the nearest barrel and moved it around the circle of adults. Water offered and taken, the most fundamental transaction available, requiring nothing of either party except the willingness to be present for it. Boyd Lassiter had positioned himself near the base of the ladder and had not spoken. When the younger straight girl began to cry softly in her sleep against her mother's shoulder, the sound barely audible beneath the muted rumble above, Boyd rose from where he was sitting and crossed the shelter slowly and crouched down near the sleeping child and began, without being asked, to hum. It was tuneless and entirely without performance, and the child's crying eased within a minute and stopped. He stayed where he was. He kept humming quietly for a child who could no longer hear him. Adeline saw it. She moved on. It was Garrett who broke the larger silence, and he did it in the unhurried way. He did everything without preamble, without theater, in the voice of a man who has decided that something needs to be said and is saying it as plainly as he knows how. "I knew Silas Marsh for a long time," he said. The quality of attention in the room changed without anyone visibly moving. It gathered and drew inward and found a new center. He came to the smithy twice a year, spring and fall, regular as the calendar. Plow work, harness fittings, pump parts. He didn't talk. Most visits, the whole transaction, finished with fewer words than I've used in the last minute. That was fine with me. Some men talk, some men don't. The ones who don't aren't necessarily saying less. He paused. One night, about a dozen years back, he stayed late. A cracked drive wheel needed recasting from the blank, and it took longer than either of us expected. By the time it was finished, the sky outside was full dark. He sat on the low stool I keep near the forge and watched me work. I don't know exactly what made him say what he said. Maybe it was the hour, late enough that a man's ordinary arrangements get tired. He told me about a storm, one from when he was a boy, 1878. The room was completely quiet except for the muted roar above them and the soft, even breathing of the sleeping straight girl. He said the sky went black at noon. He'd been in the old barn, the one that stood here before this one, and his mother had come running and taken his hand and run with him across the yard to the root cellar. He said she moved in a way he had never seen her move before, and never saw again. Like running was the only thing left in the world. She got him down the ladder, and then she covered the door. Garrett stopped. Adeline had gone still where she stood near the stove. He said when he came up 2 days later, she was still there. She hadn't moved from the door. The storm had taken everything above ground. The barn, the house. Two of his sisters who hadn't reached the cellar in time. He was 10 years old. Vesta made a sound that was involuntary, a breath drawn in too sharply and not released, and she pressed one hand flat over her mouth, and her eyes, when she opened them, were bright in a way that had nothing to do with a composure. "He told me that once," Garrett said. "Just that once, that one late night in the smithy. Then he picked up his pump wheel, settled what he owed, said good evening, and walked home. He never mentioned it again." He paused, looking at the room, taking in the full inventory of what surrounded them. He didn't want anyone feeling sorry for him. He just didn't want it to happen to anyone else. The room breathed. Adeline crossed to the desk in the corner and opened her father's final journal to the last page. The spine knew where to fall without her searching for it. She looked at his handwriting, slower and harder pressed than his earlier entries, the hand of a man who was running out of time and knew it and was finishing what needed finishing, and she began to read aloud. "October the 9th, 1878, she said. Her voice was clear and level. "The sky turned black at noon. I was 10 years old. My mother came to the barn where I was working, and she took my hand and she ran with me across the yard. She ran the way I had never seen her run before, like the running was the only thing left in the world. She got me to the cellar. She got me down the ladder. The last thing I saw before the darkness was her face above the door looking down at me. She said something. I have tried all my life to remember the exact words and I cannot. But I know what she meant. I know what she was telling me. Adeline paused. In the shelter's stillness, she could hear Hollis breathing from where he lay near the stove, his great chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of an animal at rest. When I came up 2 days later, the barn was gone. The house was gone. My father and my 2 sisters were gone. My mother was on top of the cellar door. She had not moved. I do not know how to write about this in a way adequate to what it was. I have tried many times over many years. I cannot. She had held that door against the storm that took everything above ground. And when I opened it from inside and she fell away from it, the sky above me was as clear and blue as I have ever seen a sky. Adeline lifted her eyes from the page for a moment, looked at nothing in particular, then returned. I have asked myself every year of my life since that morning what I owe to that fact, what the obligation looks like in practice, not as a feeling held privately, not as a memory, as a daily physical, concrete act in the world. I have my answer. It is not elegant, and it will not carry my name. It is barrels of water and sealed crocks, and clean air and a warm stove in the dark. It is a ladder and a door, and enough room for the people who need it. It is my mother's act performed in advance at a distance for people I may never meet. I do not need them to know. I only need it to be there. She closed the journal. The silence that followed was the deepest the shelter had held across the 2 days they spent in it. Not the silence of emptiness or shock. The silence of a room full of people who have received something they did not know they were missing and are not yet certain how to hold. Boyd Lassiter was the first to make a sound. He pressed his face into his hands, and his shoulders moved once sharply, and then were still, and he kept his face hidden for a long time. No one looked at him directly. It was the only courtesy available, and they offered it completely and without discussion. Vesta Kroom had not moved from her position against the western wall, but the thing she always carried with her, that precise structural uprightness, that carefully maintained architecture of civic authority, had gone out of her. She sat with her hands in her lap and her face open in a way Adeline had never seen it open, and she looked at the room, the shelving, the stove, the ventilation pipes, the blankets, all of it, and then she looked at the journal in Adeline's hands. I called him strange, she said. Her voice was stripped of its usual calibration. In the store, at the socials, when I thought he couldn't hear me. She stopped, shook her head once, a small, private motion. I said things I believed were true because I had never once considered whether I understood what I was looking at. I had simply decided what it meant and closed the matter. No one in the room spoke. He was the best man in this town, Vesta said, and we left him alone in it. Garrett, against the wall with his arms at his sides, looked at the floor and said nothing because there was nothing to add. In the hours that followed, the shelter settled into a different kind of quiet, habitable, and shared a space with common rhythms. The straight children woke and ate and became curious about the pipes running along the ceiling, and Adeline explained the system to the older boy, in plain terms treating his questions as deserving real answers. Garrett helped distribute water on the schedule Adeline established. Hiram Goss, who had said almost nothing since descending, eventually rose from where he had been sitting and began quietly organizing the used cups near the water barrel, a small task self-assigned. Boyd remained with the straight children through most of the first night. The younger girl had attached herself to him with the arbitrary totality of small children in crisis, and he submitted to this with a patience and steadiness that Adeline observed from across the shelter without comment. People showed themselves in difficulty. Boyd Lassiter, stripped of his audience, and his performance turned out to contain something she had not known was there. It was in the deep quiet of the second night the storm above reduced to a sustained low moaning that was merely wind, merely weather, that Opal Straight came and sat near Adeline at the desk. She sat without arranging the visit. She just sat, and for a while she was quiet, looking at her hands. I said an ugly thing to you when we came down, Opal said. You were frightened, Adeline said. Your children were frightened. I would have said something ugly too. Opal was quiet again for a moment. Then she reached into the small bag she had carried down with her, produced a length of rough knitting scraps of cloth she must have had in her coat, and worked it in silence for a while before holding it out toward Adeline. A small, unfinished scarf, simple and warm. For the cold mornings, Opal said, when this is done. Adeline took it and held it and did not trust her voice for anything more elaborate than thank you. A sound reached them through the flue sometime before dawn, sharp and percussive, a crack followed by a long, low grinding collapse somewhere above. The shelter went absolutely still. No one asked what the sound had been. They would know when they came up. The storm thinned through the morning by slow degrees, the grinding roar losing its mass and urgency, becoming a moan, becoming something that was merely wind, the ordinary atmospheric voice of a country mourning after a hard night. Hollis's ears, which had been held slightly raised for 2 full days, came quietly down. Garrett went up the ladder first. He pushed the trapdoor open slowly, and pale daylight came down into the shelter, thin and dust-filtered, but genuine and unambiguous, arriving from the east where it had always come from. He pushed the barn doors open, and they came out one at a time and stood blinking in a world that occupied the same geography as the one they had left and was unrecognizable in almost every other respect. Coldwater Flats lay beneath a blanket of black dust, 2 and 3 feet deep, smoothed by the wind into long, soft dunes that erased the distinction between road and yard, between property and open land. The general store had lost its false front, the facade stripped to bare timber. 2 houses on the north end of the main street had lost their roofs. The church stood intact but buried to its windowsills. Vesta Kroom's garden, which she had maintained with fierce and very public dedication for years, was simply gone, not damaged, erased. The beds and borders indistinguishable from the surrounding black. They stood and looked at it, and for a long time no one spoke. It was Boyd who moved first. He stood at the edge of the group, the younger and less defended version of himself that 2 days underground had produced, and he looked at the buried road and the damaged buildings and the people beside him, and he said in a voice with no performance in it at all, "We clear the straight place first. Then we work outward from there." No one argued. No one questioned the logic. Garrett came back from what remained of the smithy with 3 shovels, the most that could be located quickly, and the work began. Boyd worked beside him through most of the morning, matching his pace, and at a certain point Garrett stopped and looked at him with the brief assessing look of a man taking a measure, and then nodded once and went back to work, and Boyd went back to work beside him. Vesta did not shovel. She was clear-eyed enough about her own capabilities to know where she was most useful. What she did instead was organize which was the skills she possessed in the same deep way that Adeline possessed the shelter's inventory. Within 2 hours of coming up from the barn, she had established a cooking fire on the clear ground behind the structure, sent Ambrose running at speed to 3 neighboring properties, with word that the barn was open and people were gathering, and produced from the shelter's stores enough preserved food to feed more than 20 people a proper breakfast. She did it without announcing her intentions, simply beginning, and the people around her adjusted to accommodate the movement of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Adeline watches Vesta from across the yard and recognized something she had not expected to recognize: the same quality of purposeful motion, the same absence of wasted effort, the same fundamental assumption that work justifies itself and requires no announcement. She had spent 2 months disliking Vesta Kroom. Standing in the pale morning light with dust still in her hair, she found the feeling had emptied itself without being replaced by its opposite. What was there instead was something more complicated, something that would take time and more information before it settled into a name she trusted. Families began arriving from neighboring properties by midday, people who had sheltered where they could and were emerging now into the altered world, drawn toward the sound of other people working. The story of the barn traveled with each new group, already changing in the telling, already acquiring the modifications that stories accumulate when they pass through people who are still working out what the story means. Some of what arrived was accurate, some was approximate, but the essential truth held in every version. Silas Marsh had built something beneath his barn. His daughter had kept it. When the black wall came down on Coldwater Flats, there had been a place to go. It was on the evening of the second day after the storm that Dalton Reeves' automobile came slowly up the road, navigating the drifts. He stepped out into a yard occupied by 24 people working in easy shared rhythm, and stood for a moment taking it in before he spotted Adeline near the barn doors. He reached into his coat pocket as he crossed the yard. "Miss Marsh," he began, About the outstanding assessment. She doesn't owe you a thing, Hiram Goss said, stepping forward from where he had been stacking timber. His voice was not loud, but it was absolutely clear. Not after what she did for this town. Reeve looked at him, then at Garrett Tully, who had stopped working and was standing with his arms at his sides, watching. Then at the faces turning one by one toward the conversation, 11 of them, people who had spent 2 days in an underground room because Silas Marsh had built it and his daughter had kept it ready. Not one of them looked away. Something shifted in Dalton Reeve's face. The patient certainty he had carried through every previous encounter gave way to something smaller, something that recognized for the first time that the ground beneath him was not what he had believed it to be. He looked at the tax notice in his hand for a long moment. Then he folded it once and again and put it back in his coat pocket. He put his hat on. He walked back to his automobile and drove away down the broken road without another word, and no one watched him go for long because there was still work to do. 2 days after the storm, Garrett came down into the shelter and found Adeline at the desk updating her notebook in the careful hand she had built across the summer in unconscious imitation of her father's. He was carrying a flat leather document wallet, the brass clasp intact and undamaged. Found it this morning, he said, setting it on the desk beside her notebook. False bottom in the tin box, thin panel at the base that lifts out. He stepped back and gave her room. She reached for the wallet. Inside, protected by leather, in the cool dryness of the room, was a single folded document. She opened it carefully. A land deed, the Marsh Homestead house barn outbuildings and the full 160 acres surrounding them, made out in Adeline Marsh's name, executed and notarized 3 years before Silas Marsh's death. The county clerk's stamp clear and unambiguous in the lower right corner. He had not left it to chance. He had not trusted the uncertainty of a death without documentation or the goodwill of a county that did not always extend goodwill to those on the margins of its attention. He had walked into an office in Amarillo 3 years ago and made the land legally and permanently hers, quietly, without telling anyone it was done the same way he had done everything. I checked it this morning before coming down, Garrett said. It's on record in Amarillo. The land is yours, Adeline, fully and without question. It always will be. She sat with the deed in her hands and thought of 30 years of water barrels and beeswax seals, of a photograph at the bottom of a locked box, of a 10-year-old boy climbing out of a root cellar into a sky gone suddenly impossibly clear, and a woman who had been down there in the dark holding a door shut with the full weight of everything she had. She thought of all the years between that morning and this one, and what her father had done with them quietly and without witness, season after season. He thought of everything Garrett said, plainly, as an observation. He did, Adeline said. She folded the deed and placed it carefully in the wallet and set it on the corner of the desk beside her notebook and beside her father's 5 journals, the old and the new together in the lantern light. She climbed the ladder into the barn as the afternoon was going golden, and Hollis rose from where he had been lying and pressed his warmth against her legs, and she stood for a moment with her hand on his head, breathing the air of a Texas evening that was entirely itself again, ordinary and unhurried, carrying nothing but the familiar smell of dust and grass and open distance. Boyd Lassiter was crossing the yard with a coil of rope when he saw her in the doorway. He stopped. He had been like this since the storm, careful in a way that was different from any carefulness she had seen from him before, the carefulness of someone who has picked up a weight and discovered its true measure. He met her eyes without the grin anywhere in evidence. There's a crew coming tomorrow to start on the road, he said. I told them to begin on your property first. He paused, and in the pause she could hear the difficulty of what he was working toward, the specific difficulty of saying something true that costs more than you expected it to cost. I should have looked at what you were doing out here instead of making it into something it wasn't. He gestured vaguely, a gesture that encompassed 2 months of easy mockery and the particular cost of having been wrong in public. I'm sorry, Adeline. She looked at him long enough to be certain he was not performing it. Come back tomorrow, she said. There's work to do. He nodded and went. Vesta Kroom appeared at the edge of the property as the light was going long and warm across the dust, walking with her characteristic straight-spine bearing, though the dress she wore was borrowed and her silver hair had not been restored to its usual arrangement. She was carrying a covered dish which she brought to Adeline without ceremony and placed in her hands and stepped back. Supper, she said. Adeline looked at her. Your father kept this town alive, Vesta said, whether it deserved it or not. Whether it knew it was being kept or not. The precision that was characteristic of her was present in what came next, but it was not the precision of social management. It was something quieter and more costly. You kept it alive too. You had no reason to open that door. I want you to know that I understand that. She held Adeline's gaze for a moment, something honest present on both sides of it. Then she turned and walked back toward the road. Adeline stood in the barn doorway with the covered dish warm in her hands, and Hollis leaning his full weight against her leg in the clear sky above, and looked out at Coldwater Flats making itself again in the long golden light. The sound of hammers and voices and the creak of lumber being moved. Further down the road, the sound of children playing, which was perhaps the most insistent sound a community could produce. The sound that insisted most forcefully on the continuation of ordinary things. Ambrose Tully crossed the yard with a fence post on his shoulder, stopping when he saw her. He was the first one to show up each morning and the last to leave each evening, and he did it without announcement. He looked at her for a moment with the clear attentiveness of someone who has made a decision about something and is at peace with the decision, and then he nodded once the way his brother nodded and went on with his work. Garrett passed on his way home as the light was finally failing. He slowed when he saw her standing in the lantern-lit doorway and stopped. Your father built something that outlasted the storm, he said. His voice was quiet in the evening air. So did you. She held his gaze. He nodded once. He walked on into the dark. The people of Coldwater Flats stopped calling her Dusty Adeline. It happened without announcement, without ceremony, the way the important changes always happen in that flat and honest country. They started calling her the Keeper, and the name fit in the way that her father's silences had finally fully come to make sense, not as something strange or broken, but as something that had been love all along, patient and practical, and built one careful season at a time, waiting in the dark for the day it would be needed. She went inside to eat her supper. Behind her, the barn stood open to the clean evening air. Its doors unlatched the way they had been through the whole long summer, easy to reach and easy to open, ready, in the same uncelebrated way it had always been ready for whoever needed it next.